Through the mists comes forth RPGaDay! In the year 2021, RPGaDay comes back for its 8th year. A time in August when every day we tackle another question or topic by answering in a way that uplifts the gaming community and answers questions people might have about this crazy hobby of ours that serves to build the community and bring it up, that many of us make blogs about, video blogs, art, or great works. In celebration of the community of gamers, I welcome you to RPGaDay 2021. Hello friends, I am Rob, the Dungeon Tutor, also Omnisci sometimes, and today is the 17th day of RPGaDay, the 17th of August, which means today the topic word is trap. Now, trap is something that if you've been in role-playing games for a decent length of time, you've probably run up against. There are entire books dedicated to traps and making them varied and interesting, like, say, Grimtooth traps, which vary from the fantastical and implausible to the, if magic is possible, this would definitely be a thing. And it gives the game master a whole host of ideas on ways to bedevil their players. Now, the role of traps has changed quite a bit over the course of gaming history. It started out as a legitimate threat in dungeons, when the idea of a role-playing game was to have a character that would go into a dungeon and try to kill the monsters and get the treasure. A lot of times that treasure would be guarded by traps, and that seems to make sense to most people. I mean, traps can work even when nobody is around, and if they're successful, that means that their opponents will be thwarted in whatever way you devise. They can be inconvenienced, they might be ejected from the dungeon, they may be killed or maimed. Depends on the trap, of course. And players have been bedeviled by these things for a long time too, because, well, there's rarely treasure involved with them. They're not something that grant you experience points in the early day, although later they can be considered a challenge and therefore worthy of granting experience. I've kind of always held that there should be some kind of a bonus for defeating a trap. But they're generally low-reward threats that just serve to chip away at the group and sometimes sneakily kill somebody, or separate the party, or do all kinds of things. Now, I've never been a huge fan of step-and-die traps. I think I've killed a total of 3, maybe 4 characters with traps ever. And the one that's leaping out in my mind, it was written into the adventure. This wasn't something that I did maliciously. But there were some warnings that were ignored for the lure of treasure. And when it happened to the character, she kind of looked back and goes, she deserved it, but I like that character. And I sympathize. I do. I really don't like killing people off with traps, especially if they're the kind of traps that are just kind of stuck there without warning. Pit traps, for instance, I think are kind of unfair, which is why players have developed means of bypassing them. Tired of either falling down nuisance traps, which is a pain, or falling down deadly traps. That's why most people in olden days would have a stout 10-foot pole and would be poking the ground in front of them, 10 feet being enough distance to give you leverage to spring traps and enough distance so that you don't get caught in them yourself. And of course, when you come up with that, of course the game master is free to come up with a trap that can thwart somebody poking ahead with a pole. For example, pressing a tripwire that causes the ceiling behind to collapse or something like that. It's a measure, countermeasure competition sometimes in how you design these things. But realistically, traps exist for two purposes. Number one, to keep your players on their toes. And number two, to drain their resources. Maybe it's time, the time it takes to disable a trap or to work around it, or to maybe injure them so that they have to stop and rest, or they have to expend some healing magic, maybe potions or something like that. Maybe they cast a spell or two that they would otherwise have cast for some other purpose in the dungeon. So that's generally always been the point of traps. Now, the greater the prize, the more dangerous the traps might, be justified in using. For instance, in front of the grand treasure room. If you're players and your characters are advancing down the hall, and in the next room you see it's lined with gold, just piles and piles of gold and treasure and gems, and you've fought your way through the dungeon. You've earned treasure. You've bled for it. You've fought tough, tense fights, and you're looking ahead and you see an empty room that's just full of treasure. Anybody who's ever played role-playing games should immediately have a red flag pop up. Treasure like that is never unguarded. It may not be guarded by something that's alive, but that just means it's even more devious, or it's a false treasure, or it goes on and on and on. But your experience with traps certainly should tell you, you better be very, very careful. A convenient treasure is usually the worst trap. It's also, there are plenty of other kinds of traps, and there are certain locales that, of course, seem to draw them. So I thought I would give you my top 5 locations for traps. And this is generally buoyed out by things like, Grimtooth and that. So these are the situations for all of you who don't quite have the experience to take something from this grizzled old gamer and be of note. Number 5, corridors. Now you might say to yourself, corridor is just a long room that separates 2 rooms and connects them. It's also generally a place where you don't have a great deal of movement, maybe 2 people wide, maybe a single file, so you know exactly where everybody is going to be who goes down it. That's all a trap maker needs. I know where you're going to be, so I'll design something to punish you for being there. So if you see a corridor, especially with any length to it, pretty decent chance that there might be a trap there, if you're in a locale that's likely to have traps. If not trap, if the place is inhabited, then that's also a great place for an ambush. Just put something there that can tie up people so they can't come running down, and it's a turkey shoot if you could pop out on one end with a couple of archers and just start raining arrows in, or a spellcaster to start lobbing spells. All it takes is something like a grease spell or oil, something to separate the party and make them work their way around that situation. Just tie them up for a little bit. Caltrips are another fun one because they aren't obvious. But you run into them and, yeah, they can be there. If you salt the entire thing through with caltrips, it can make a very, very brutal charge to try to stop your ambush. But you don't have to necessarily go that far. There's plenty of low-tech ways of dealing with it. Not suspended from the ceiling, for instance, to slow people down and allow you a few extra rounds to plunk some arrows into people or fling a few more spells. And now that 5th edition cantrips being cast again and again and again, they work perfectly fine for these kind of ambushes too. But traps make a lot of sense in corridors. So that's my number 5. If you see a long stretch of corridor, definitely. Number 4, and this really, I don't know if this is even fair, but ceilings. How many people walk into a room and immediately look up? Not very many. And in my experience, a lot of players just stop at the initial description of a room without saying, I look up. But how many traps and how many monsters come from up there? It's the place you're least likely to pay any notice to. You're more likely to look down and see the place you're going to be walking onto than looking up and seeing what's hanging over your head. So, yeah, noticing a feature like, there are spikes hanging from the ceiling. Unless they're all over the ceiling, in which case, popping your head and you might look up and chance to notice them. But if there's spikes directly above for a spike trap that's to drop down on you as you walk into the room, how often does that get noticed? Honestly, by my measurement of modern players that I've seen, not very often. They're more likely to go into the room and immediately look at the feature of note that caught their eye in the description. Ceilings are probably one of the best vectors for trap makers in any kind of a room, because you don't have to hide anything behind any tricks or secrets, sliding panels, or any other features you have to hide your trap in. Just suspend it from the ceiling. And it can be relatively crude and cumbersome looking, but if it's, say, out of the field of view, like somebody just walking into the room, you'll catch a fair number of people. So looking up is an absolutely essential skill for any role player of any degree if you're going to go into a place that might be dangerous. Anything other than modern, I would say, and maybe futuristic. But looking up is almost always a good idea if you're in an uncertain location. A lot of traps come from there. So, Number three is one of my absolute favorites, and that is doors. Doors are just like corridors. They're a place that are a fixed location where people are going to have to pass through one way or the other. You already have a certain expectation from doors anyhow. If you're not supposed to be there, there's a good chance it'll be locked or barred. If you're in a dungeon that's been kind of abandoned, maybe it's damp and musty, they might be swollen and stuck, which means it's an impediment you may have to force through using brute strength or cunning. But they're already an impediment there. It's only natural, too, since people have to go in and out, that it also be a focal point for traps. And those traps can be many and varied. There are so many different ways that you can trap a door. From trapping the actual mechanism for opening the door, a handle, a knob, from contact poison to elaborate blades and darts and stabby needles and so many lovely ways that you can really cause trouble for a person who's trying to open a door. Locks often have traps too. Shouldn't probably be as likely as something on the handle itself, but honestly, one of the greatest threats to security in a place is going to be somebody picking your locks if you are a dungeon designer. So finding a way to specifically eliminate a person trying to do that, well, if you're going to have deadly traps, that might be one, because the person doing it is decidedly doing something unsafe. So there's that. Also, the door itself may have runes, glyphs, whatnot on it. It may be that the door itself is a reservoir for something, acid in case somebody tries to smash through it, or poison gas in case somebody breaches it with an axe chop or something and lets all the gas come out into the people who are trying to force the door. That can be a fun one. Although, of course, the technology behind that is trickier. Making a hollow door isn't necessarily impossible, but making it so that it looks like any other door is going to be more challenging. It would actually be easier to do in our modern doors that usually look like they're already some sort of a composite than one that looks like it's supposed to be made of solid planks. So, as a thought. Of course, too, sometimes the traps are just what's living in the door. For example, an entire trap creature, ear seekers, basically are there in case somebody tries to listen to the door. These tiny little creatures jump into the ears and cause all kinds of mischief and mayhem. So they're specifically there just to thwart people from doing what comes naturally and try to listen at the door to get some clue as to what's on the other side. Doors are nasty, and a skilled adventurer's blood pressure should go up a little bit from just looking at a new door. And sometimes those doors can make it fairly obvious. You put a certain relief on a door that makes it look like there could be traps hidden in it, or that just themselves look grisly. For example, coming in on a massive double door. Size also helps to make things a bit tenser. And there's an image of the Grim Reaper harvesting men in relief against the door. And he seems to be striding from the left door to the right door with his grim scythe, and the people on the right door are frozen in fear as he is coming for them. If you don't immediately suspect that that's going to be trapped as heck, you really are new to this, aren't you? Yeah. Yeah, that's there's not a lot of places where that seems normal outside of a death temple or something. So, number 3, doors. Number 2, locations of focus. Now, this is kind of cheating, but quite honestly, every room generally that has a purpose and a focus has something that draws the eye naturally. If you are in an evil temple, that altar is probably drawing your attention, or maybe it's some sort of effigy, but it's there to draw the attention of the believers, and it should draw the attention of those bursting into it without their permission. So that's a good thing to have trapped. If it's a throne room, the throne itself is a center of focus, and therefore pretty good chance that it's trapped. Especially if it's very important that only the nobility can sit in it. Well, then only the nobility are trained how to stop the trap from killing you. That seems to make a lot of sense too. And again, anything that you're naturally drawn to should set off warning bells. Now, sometimes the trap isn't literally on the object. Sometimes that can make life complicated. If you're a high priest, you don't want to accidentally hit the lever that sends the blade scything your arms off as you're about to commit the sacrifice. That's embarrassing and very, very amateur hour. So, a lot of times the trap will be somewhere around that object. For example, a ring of pit traps creating a moat around the altar might be useful for defense. Number 1, if you trigger it in advance. B, a nasty surprise for somebody trying to come up to the altar unbidden. And can add to the mystique, honestly, of that altar being a place where souls are collected for their dread god, as the altar itself can seem to defend itself by plunging them into an abyss, hopefully to die. These are all elements that that somebody who puts these things together on purpose, with a purpose, and not just randomly strewing things about, might really think about. If you can't always count that you're going to have living guards that are more scary than a trap that you could devise being there, makes a lot of sense to put a trap there. Especially if you're the kind of person who relishes the idea that their enemies are going to be either put into a compromising position, injured, or killed as a result of the temerity of coming into something that you hold as being important. So all of those things that are the important item in the room should set up a warning flag. And if you have, for instance, a person who specializes in traps, that's where you should set them off. It's like, find out if it's safe to get there. Find out if the item is safe. Find out how we can get anything good out of it. Common delvering techniques. But, again, something I find that a lot of people are kind of missing out on. A lot of players that I've seen come into something like that and say, okay, now how can we interact with that to further the story? Not in itself a bad question, but you might ignore the dangers that are frequently on such things. So, if you're at all suspicious that your game master might employ traps, those are a couple of objects that really, really have a strong chance of being trapped. And the final one. This is the one that almost every player should be aware of, the numerous dangers of chests. Yes, chests. Chests are such a trap magnet that even monsters are traps. The Mimic, of course. And that's not the only one, but still, it's a good one. Where if you see a chest, which is often the repository for the treasure, the loot, the items that you've come looking to pilfer, burgle, steal, rip off, whatever, chests are a natural magnet for traps. If you see a chest in the wild, you would definitely be in the right to think that that might have something just defend itself, even if you've taken care of any other defense on it. I can't tell you the number of times I've had players run afoul of traps. And again, I don't usually kill off players with traps, but if you are the kind of person who can afford a trap that can kill somebody, and you are amoral enough to use something like poison on your foes, and you're hardcore enough to believe that that thing won't misfire if you properly open it using the key or whatever technique that you have, then yeah, that's the time to break out the lethal stuff, because there's already the promise that there's something that could be there on any chest that I've ever seen. Unless it's of so mean a state. If it's a common, like a lockbox stuck under a bed, might have less chance of being trapped, but I'd still check it twice. And of course, the ways that these things could be trapped are legion. Sometimes the chest itself is a trap. Again, see mimics. But even beyond that, chests can be really, really annoying traps. For example, one that is a block of adhesive covered over with a solid lead structure that's painted like a chest and has a super strong adhesive, think sovereign glue, that the players touch, and now you're stuck to a massive lead block. Be even special bonus points if there's a trigger underneath it that sounds dinner bells for the monsters of the dungeon while they're stuck to this chest. Be great. But anyhow, that's just one example. I mean, the blades, pits, explosives, magic runes, curses, and so many different ways of delivering poison. I favor gas. It not only punishes the person, but the smart aleck who says they're going to stand off to the side. Yeah, give it a good 10-foot cloud, get everybody around. Smart people, when somebody goes up to examine a chest, stay at least 30 feet back. And even that might not be enough. The back of the room, if it's a particularly large room, is probably even better. However, sometimes that's not even safe, as I've seen traps that don't hit the person who's there, but cause everybody else in the room mischief some way, shape, or form. There was one. The space directly in front of the trap had nothing, but every other floor in the room would have spikes shooting up, just to punish people who aren't the thief. Pretty nasty, but I suspect that's a reflex from watching other people watch in safety while the thief takes all the risks. So, just like anything, you can figure out something to bedevil any group realistically, but that's kind of tipping your hand that you're doing this maliciously. And there's even a few in the Grimtooth Traps books too, where it talks about not getting the first person, but getting everybody behind them. But chests are just so easy to trap, and so many different stages. What's inside can be a trap, absolutely deadly. Load it up with vipers or something that inflict poison right off the bat, and you have a rockin' good time. Make it so that the lid is hinged, so that when it's opened, it opens, but then as soon as it's opened, it snaps back with the lip of the chest being razor sharp. Look to clunk somebody in the head or their arms as they're reaching inside, or something that'll kick it after it's been open for about 20 seconds, just to make sure that they have a chance to go looting inside the chest. As a game master myself, I can think of so many different ways of making chests nasty. The old standby is, of course, with the poison needle on the lock. And an unlocked chest almost screams out that it's going to be even more dangerous, because sometimes the lock is the deterrent. There's only certain people who are good enough to get by a particularly difficult lock. And if somebody is going to bash their way through, which is always a possibility, then to the point where a lock isn't useful, oftentimes if you're already accepting that chest could be lost, putting your delicate things inside something like that, like your stacks and stacks and stacks of potion bottles. So if somebody smashes through that chest, they're going to open it up and it's going to be full of wet glass. Or if you love immiscibility, possibilities where, if potions mingle, unpredictable side effects can happen. That could be fun. But eventually players only have to do that a couple of times and lose precious treasure by smashing things with violence before they realize that sometimes playing the game and figuring out how to open up that chest without smashing it can be more profitable in the long run. And also, finding somebody who can try to deal with those kind of traps is definitely more profitable for your group and healthier as well, especially once they get a little skilled and can find more difficult traps, as in the old days when you had percentiles that weren't very large to find traps early on. That would get quickly better, so on purpose. But those are my thoughts on traps. The 5 most likely places that you're going to find traps. Now, you can, of course, go outside of those 5 things. But quite honestly, if you're an adventurer and you see corridors, you're tempted to go into a place where you can't see the ceiling or you don't think to look up for whatever reason, doors. Yeah, doors. Some kind of thing of focus that just draws you to it. Or chests. Stop a second. Let the Game Master know you're taking a look. You're observing everything around. And if you have somebody with the skills that can find traps, that's the time to send them up and have them take a good look over before you feel safe about doing any more exploration. Likewise, some people really hate it when the Game Master makes rules for players, but I always felt that finding traps is the kind of thing that a Game Master should always roll for. Because if you roll and you say you don't find any traps, the players don't know if you rolled well or not. So they can take that at face value. If you let them roll, and they roll a natural 20, there's no traps here. Or if there are a trap, I better have found it. Takes the mystery out of it a little bit, doesn't it? I think that looking for traps should always be an uncertain thing, and that's probably the best example of when a player shouldn't roll for their own check. But it's a relatively minor point for some and a major sticking point for others. So to your own group, to listen to what they want and what they think is right, and let that guide you. But those are my thoughts on traps. Hopefully you like this. Maybe you thought of something along the way that's interesting. Maybe you have your own comments that you'd love to leave below about what I might have missed, what thing to you screams out trap more than what I've come up with. And maybe you thought this was so good that you'd like to like it, subscribe, hit the notification button. Sure. More importantly, if you find anybody else whose traps are really flat or they don't seem to know what traps really are for, if they think they're for punishing the players, for instance, or whatever, feel free to link and share this. I don't mind, and it might help your game somewhat if you can rein in a game master who loves using traps just to screw with people. But yeah, that's I definitely would love to discuss in the comments if you have any thoughts on your own. So thank you very much. Until next time, I am Rob, I am the Dungeon Tutor, and I am Omnisci. And I will hopefully see you next. We have several more videos left. And if this is the first you've seen, I've got plenty more that I've made behind me. So hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you, and farewell.